Hey guys, it's Willie McBride. I've been following the San Pedro OCR using the SailBoss Race Viewer, and I wanted to share a couple of insights here from the first 2 days of racing that I've noticed when watching the starts and the first beats. So right here we're looking at the first start of the first race of the regatta, and what we can see here from this band is we can see the density of the line represented in the thickness of this rainbow colored band as we come down the line. So where we see it be really thick here, that means there were a lot of boats fighting it out down at the boat end, and where we see it thin down at the pin here, there was less density. There was very little density in this spot in the middle, and very little density down here at the pin relative to the boat end. And what we're looking at right now in terms of colors is we're looking at what the rankings of these boats were 25% of the way up the beat, and how likely you were to be top 10 if you started in that zone. So where we see the green, this is showing us that at this pin end, if you started down there, you were very likely to be top 10 by 25% of the way up the first beat. This is something that we saw quite a bit on the first day in this established sea breeze, where a lot of the fleet was fighting it out for this boat end, and as a result, you had a lot of people getting flushed out down here, high risk, whereas starting at the pin was relatively low risk because of this low density. And so the end result was that the boats down here at the pin had really good outcomes 25% of the way up the beat. And that kind of repeated itself in race 2, which we're looking at here, and in race 3, which we're looking at here, where we can see down here at the pin, we have a lot of green, we have much lower density, and again, at the boat, really high density. What was really interesting to see, though, is if we move this slider to the right here and say, instead of looking 25% of the way up the first beat, we actually want to look 30% of the way up the first beat. In each of these races, the pattern that we saw repeated was that 30% of the way up the beat, the right-hand side started to pay. And all of a sudden, we can see that this blue line here shifts down towards the boat end. And that's because this right-hand side starts to get strong, and the boats who escape down here on that right-hand side start to look quite good 30% of the way up the beat. And if we look farther up the beat, it shifts even a little bit farther right, and we see some green pockets start to appear down here, even in the high density. So the takeaway for me here on this first day in this established sea breeze is that if we were looking 25% of the way up the first beat, it was high percentage to start down here in the low density at the pin. But as we started to get farther up the beat, the better results started to come from that boat end. But what's interesting to me is that that's if we're shooting to be in the top 10 by the 50% of the way up the first beat. But if we're more mid-fleet, if what a good result to us means is that we're top 20 or top 25 by 50% of the way up the first beat, we can move this slider to the right. And we see it start to move back towards the left. So here's 42% of the way up the first beat. If we wanted to be in the top 25, again, the blue bar shifts back towards that pin end. And what that tells us is that if you wanted to be top 10, you needed to fight it out at this boat end. But if you're really searching for more of a mid-fleet finish in this regatta or in this race, or if you think rounding the top mark in the top 25 is good enough, then maybe the higher percentage move is actually to start down closer to the pin. And that's something that we saw repeated in all of the races on day 1. So we're going to flip over here to day 2. This is the first race on day 2. Much lighter breeze in the morning. We saw a much more even spread on the starting line. So if we zoom out, we don't have that same bulge of density down here at the boat end. We do have the most density of anywhere on the line at the boat end, but you can see that the fleet is more evenly spread, a little bit more density at the pin, less density in the middle, and much more of an even distribution in terms of where people had those best results from. We see a little pocket of green down here at the pin, little pocket of green in the middle, and a pretty good pocket of green actually down here at that boat end. And so on day 2, in the less established breeze, I think because we just had a little bit less density, we had more boats getting off the line cleanly down here at the boat end, and we actually had quite a good pocket, and that blue indicator of where the high percentage escape was actually down here at the boat end. If we move the sliders and we look a little farther up the course, it just becomes a little bit more solidly boat, but still very much in that realm. And if we move the slider up and say, hey, we actually wanted to be top 25, again, still saying that starting at the boat end was our high percentage move here on day 2 in race 1. And if we flip over to race 2 on day 2, we start to see actually a quite interesting distribution on the line. Really low density here in the middle of the line to the pin third, and quite high density down here at the boat. But what's interesting about this race is that as that breeze ticked up, as the race course got a little bit longer, we see that the right-hand side, again, is the place to be, and fighting it out in that density down at the boat is actually really worthwhile thing. And again, if we move the slider to the right and we look a little bit farther up the course, it only becomes more green as we get farther up the course, and we're looking at the 50% mark or the 42% mark of the way up that first beat. If you were looking for a mid-fleet finish and looking to be top 25%, again, still high percentage move was to start down here at the boat. So hopefully that helps you think through a little bit of these dynamics of, you know, in a venue like San Pedro where people are fighting for a favored side of the course, knowing how important it is to fight for that favored side and how much risk you're willing to take given the density of the fleet versus where those opportunities are to start in the low density and actually have a really good rounding by the top if you start down on the side that's not on the favored side of the course. I think if you're a top contender, you've got to fight it out for that favored side. But if you're more mid-fleet, especially in this established sea breeze, there are some opportunities where a lot of people are fighting it out down at the boat end. And if you can take advantage of that space at the pin, you can actually have a really good rounding around that first top mark. Hopefully that's helpful, and I'll be following the rest of the event.